Both the original Star Fox on the SNES and Star Fox 64 are heralded as two of Nintendo's most influential games, the former for being ahead of its time and the latter for being timeless. Until recently, I'd only ever played either briefly, and that was about a year ago. I wanted to compare the flight mechanics to those of Star Fox Adventures for its respective video, and I wanted to get a sense of why many people weren't happy with the new direction of the series. I assumed it was the shift away from a focus on the rail shooter genre, but I was very wrong, because the Star Fox series up to that point was so much more.
Good luck.
The original Star Fox was one of the most ambitious games developed in the SNES era. It was the first game to use 3D polygonal graphics on the console, and only one of very few. Nintendo could have just rested on the laurels of its groundbreaking visuals, not to mention the fantastic music, but that's not all that makes Star Fox special. It's not just a rail shooter. There are teammates to fight with, save, and manage, multiple difficulty modes in the form of routes with different levels, and secrets that can lead to unique warp points between the three. There are really impressive visuals that sell each level's theme. It looks great, considering this is on a 16-bit console. I was particularly struck by the Space Armada level. Despite the blocky visuals, I really felt like it was a battle, like I was in the opening scenes of Return of the Jedi. The game further supports this by switching between a third-person and first-person point of view, which feels really cool in the moment, but does lead well into some of the game's flaws. Before I get into those, I want to note that the fact that Nintendo got Star Fox to function on the SNES in the first place is difficult to overstate. This game was incredibly ambitious and experimental, but that does not mean it's without issues. Its graphically intense nature led to many limitations in game design and performance. They're not hard to identify. The game runs between 10 and 15 frames per second on average, often dipping lower. As a result, it can be quite unclear what is actually happening on screen. And because the polygonal geometry needs to be so simple in order to run, it can be very difficult to discern between friend and foe, which is quite important when the survival of the Star Fox team is part of the scoring process. Sometimes it's hard to tell what is and isn't a projectile. When a lot is happening on screen, the healing circles can look an awful lot like enemy fire and vice versa, and that's just one of many examples. The difference between third and first person is one of trade-offs. The third person mode doesn't have a reticle, so it's much harder to judge distance and aim properly. The first person mode does have a reticle, so aiming is easier, but because you don't have a full view of the environment, it is much harder to avoid damage. And yet, despite all this, I got used to the visuals pretty quick. I realized that while it can be hard to tell what's going on, the trajectory of projectiles and shape of all hitboxes are remarkably consistent. I do wonder if the projectiles the player fires are wider and taller than the visuals portray, however. It felt like there was some level of grace by the game. Make no mistake though, this game is really hard. Not only is it just generally difficult to survive, but healing items, bombs, and upgrades are quite uncommon, and the game functions on a life and continue system. Lose all of your lives? Run out of continues? It's back to the beginning of the game. Which, of course, is partially why the game is so short. You can clear the game within an hour, and much quicker if you're an experienced and skilled player. There's no saving either. If you turn the game off, it's also back to the beginning. This may have been due to hardware limitations, or it may have just been an intentional choice by the developers, or both. I played on NSO though, and thank goodness I did, because I'm not sure I could have beaten the game in any kind of reasonable time without save states. It's the first time I ever even used them in an NSO game. But the thing about the original Star Fox is that it was an incredibly ambitious proof of concept. But Nintendo was not satisfied with this. They took that proof of concept and produced pure excellence in Star Fox 64.
Good luck.
If I had to use one word to describe Star Fox 64, it'd be cinematic. Seriously, the game is like playing a movie, and I don't think that's by accident. It's famously inspired by sci-fi series like Star Wars and Star Trek. The impressive for their time visuals, supported by the once again fantastic music, the fully voiced cutscenes, minimal by today's standards, but this was on the N64 in 1997. The banter. There are so many famous quotes that I had no idea originated with this game. Heck, even the way the game handles its backstory is pretty slick. Not just letting the beginning of the game lore dump rest, but supporting it with various voice lines throughout each level. Even the credits are great, especially the invoice at the end. That made me laugh and is a creative way to essentially display your score. And that's just one layer of the presentation. Star Fox 64 has some truly striking levels, and they are dripping with thematics. My favorite so far is easily Solar. You're flying along the surface of a star that somehow has living creatures, and there's even an Andross-created behemoth you need to destroy. You have to manage constant damage to your shields due to the heat, but you're rewarded with tons of healing, bombs, and upgrades. Another I really liked was Katina. That level has you in a huge firefight with a swarm of enemies, and then battling a giant mothership. Gosh, or Fortuna, which also has you in a firefight with an enemy team in Star Wolf. This level has an extra layer of immersion because the banter from your allies and enemies mixes together, and there are so many little conversations. There's history there. I haven't even seen every level yet. There's so much more I want to check out in future playthroughs. Speaking of playthroughs, both Star Fox SNES and Star Fox 64 are incredibly short. But 64 is one of the most replayable games I've ever seen. It's a stark improvement over the first game. The ability to influence which route you take by completing secret objectives and slowly unlocking each planet over multiple playthroughs provides great incentive to keep coming back. And once again, the developers decided to maintain the inability to save within a run, which absolutely was not a hardware limitation this time around. This was a choice, and a good one, I think. The gameplay is also vastly superior in 64, with more movement options, full range mode, which takes a lot of getting used to and I feel has a very high skill ceiling. Different vehicles with really cool levels to fit them. I also appreciate that third and first person points of view are always an option, and that third person has a reticle this time around, which is just a pure improvement. There's a lot more enemy variety and much more unique ideas for bosses. Honestly, Andross was one of the least interesting out of them all. It's also just way more clear what's actually going on. Enemies have consistent models, whether near or far, and allies are clearly marked with the first letter of their name. But even Bill and his forces who do not have markers are easy to distinguish because of the clever shape language. I couldn't even count how often I hit my allies in the original Star Fox because it was hard to tell what I was shooting at in the first place. Even just the intricacies of the gameplay are clearer. Like, I couldn't tell if the barrel roll in Star Fox SNES gave invincibility frames. I'm pretty sure it doesn't, but I don't really know. But I know for sure that it does in 64. The projectile and hitbox size curiosity from earlier also doesn't exist in 64. It's always clear whether something was or wasn't hit, and by what. With that said, there is one thing I think the original did better, and that's control options. I simply do not like inverted controls for flight gameplay. When I tilt the thumbstick up, I want to move up. When I tilt the thumbstick down, I want to move down. Yes, I know the reverse is how flight simulators work, and yes, I know that's how real-world flying mechanics function. I don't care. That's not how I want to play. It's confusing to me. Hence, I always chose option C in Star Fox SNES, but that setting simply doesn't exist in Star Fox 64. Controls are certainly more consistent in 64 for sure, but some of the maneuvers are a little confusing to execute. U-turns were particularly hard for me, I just couldn't get them down. But I can't fault the game for this. It was designed for the N64 controller, but I was playing on NSO with a Switch Pro controller, which are very different from each other. I'd have to test the game with an N64 controller to truly assess whether the controls are consistent or not. But I do recognize that the addition of a thumbstick on the N64 controller compared to the directional buttons on that of a SNES may have contributed to the developer's decision to remove control options. But I can't say I understand why. That's a moot point though. The fact is, I can't believe how awesome Star Fox 64 is. Like, the original is great. Groundbreaking, but I'm good and done with that game. I actually want to keep playing 64, like a lot. I want to see all the planets, find more unique dialogue, and just see everything the game has to offer. I'd even like to try the multiplayer with my friends. There's a general sentiment that it is one of the best games on the N64, and I can see why. Star Fox 64 is an absolute triumph. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Let me know your favorite Star Fox 64 quote in the comments, and please consider liking and subscribing if you've enjoyed this. I've also opened YouTube memberships if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching.